Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chope. I apologise to the House. I missed the first few minutes of the debate this morning. The case of Raif Badawi highlights just how bad the situation on human rights is in Saudi Arabia, but it's not the only case. And the points I want to put, which I hope the Minister will be able to reply, are quite simply these in quite short order. The UN Human Rights Council has issued many concerns about human rights in Saudi Arabia, many concerns about the judicial process and many concerns about the plight of individuals there. It doesn't appear on the surface to have affected very much of the British government's relationship with Saudi Arabia and not made, as far as I can work out, very many remarks to the Saudi government to try and bring about some kind of change. I think we also need to ask the link between the very substantial sales of British arms to Saudi Arabia and our apparent inability to criticise the human rights record there. And if the Minister will confirm what controls take place on the export of arms, how many arms licences have been refused, and how many of the weapons or equipment sent to Saudi Arabia have been used for internal repression, to suppress demonstrations, or to control prisons in Saudi Arabia. The activities of Saudi Arabia in Yemen are extremely well known, and it's not a secret that they are occupying or have been occupying quite large parts of Yemen in order to restore the original government to power there. There are also disturbing reports that they've been using illegal cluster bombs during the bombardment of Yemen, and I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm that's the case, or if not, could the Foreign Office find out exactly what weapons have been used by Saudi Arabia that would be illegal within within international law. The question of arms supplies has troubled both Germany and Sweden. They have at times either suspended or restricted arms supplies to Saudi Arabia because of human rights abuses and because of their concern about what they would actually be used for in the end. But apparently this doesn't appear to have restricted the British government very much. In the Foreign Office Human Rights Report of 2014, and I quote, Saudi Arabia continued to make incremental improvements on human rights in 2014 as the government carried on implementing its reform programme. It goes on to say, we have continued concerns over the human rights situation, particularly in relation to the death penalty, access to justice, women's rights, restriction on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and freedom of religious belief. There was some progress on women's rights and the death penalty, but significant institutional change in Saudi Arabia is needed to protect the human rights of residents with regards to the guardianship system and restrictions on the freedom of religion belief. In fact, the number of executions has gone up over the past 2 years, not gone down. And it goes on to say that there were significant changes in the justice sector when the Secretary of State for Justice, visited Saudi Arabia and signed a memorandum of understanding with the Saudi Arabian Minister of Justice. This should act as a mechanism for dialogue on human rights issues. I think we need to know from the Minister how many times there's been meetings with the Saudi government, what has actually been achieved by this dialogue, and what improvements have resulted in the human rights record in Saudi Arabia as a result of it. Because there are many very disturbing reports, particularly the plight of human rights defenders who seem to have very little protection in law, are often brutally silenced when they try to speak out about human rights abuses, particularly away from the big cities and in more remote parts of the country. And the guardianship system for women means that women's rights are extremely restricted all over the country. Yet we carry on as though everything is normal with Saudi Arabia. The last point, I'd be grateful. Yes, of course, yes.
Government officials have stated that they have a blatant opposition to gay rights in Saudi Arabia, and they have criticised human rights policies which guarantee free liberties for anyone. On that point, it's evidential that recent police raids indicate that primarily gay people have been targeted, and several arrests have been conducted as part of the authorities' latest crackdown on LGBT. Would the Honourable Member join me in condemning this activity?
Absolutely, and I thank the member for drawing the House attention to that situation. The abuse of all human rights in Saudi Arabia is very serious, but the treatment of people lesbian and gay people is particularly appalling. And whilst we, and as the UK, the Human Rights Council, routinely take up issues of systemic discrimination in many countries all over the world, there seems to me to be an unfortunate silence when where Saudi Arabia is concerned, and I believe not the actions that should be taken. Yes, of course, I give way.
The intervention. He's a long-serving member of this Parliament, and I have no doubt he's been on many a protest over the years outside the Saudi embassy. Can he, off the top of his head, point to a meaningful public condemnation of the Saudi government's regime over the years he has been debating this issue in this House? Can he think of one or perhaps two?
Ministers have often said to me that they are concerned about human rights in Saudi Arabia, and usually the narrative from the Foreign Office is that constructive dialogue is making progress. It is not obvious to me what progress has been made in this matter, but that is often what is said. But the Minister, I'm sure, can speak for himself. The last point I want to make is about migrant workers. There are hundreds of thousands of migrant workers all over the Gulf states. They are doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do. They run the economy, they run the oil industry, they clean people's houses, they fix the roads, they run the railways, they run just about everything. The whole economy relies completely on them. Generally speaking, the treatment of migrant workers is poor everywhere. 300,000 were removed, deported from Saudi Arabia. Others who've protested in any way about their conditions of work have been summarily removed from the country. And we ought to be aware that this is a systemic problem across the whole region. British companies are heavily involved in service industries and oil exploration and oil exploitation in Saudi Arabia and other places. I'm not saying British companies are particularly exploiting migrant workers, but I do say that Britain should not be turning a blind eye to what is actually happening to very many very vulnerable people all across that region. What's happening in Qatar has at last got some publicity, where the numbers of migrant workers have died on construction sites. It is not that different in every other country across the region. So what I hope when the Minister comes to reply to this debate, he'll be able to tell us is that there's going to be really tough representations made to the Saudi Arabian government, that we will suspend arms supplies to Saudi Arabia if they are shown to be using weapons illegally in the Yemen, and also in the past they've been used in Bahrain, and that we will demand rights for women, we will demand an end to the death penalty, and we will also be demanding rights and justice for the migrant workers within that region. We cannot just say, because this is a country that is oil rich, because it has huge amounts of money that buy arms from this country and other places, the standards of human rights should be lower because of that money. We should say the standards of human rights should be the same. The Declaration on Human Rights is, after all, the universal declaration. It's not a selective declaration, and I think we should make that clear in our foreign policy relationships with Saudi Arabia.